Husband refused to finalize our divorce. Said I'll ruin you first. I found out he had an illegal offshore account, reported him to the IRS, and now he's being investigated for tax fraud, facing up to 20 years. My name is Noreen Castillo. For years, I was the quiet, polished wife of a man everyone described as charming and endlessly charismatic. Dax, short for Daxton, which he loved saying as though it were some royal title, was the kind of man who could sweep people off their feet. When I met him, he was exactly what a fresh transplant from Ohio dreams about when they moved to New York. We met on my third day in Manhattan, at a small, upscale Italian restaurant in Soho, where I was just starting as an event coordinator. Dax was a financial advisor for a big firm, with an office right in the heart of Wall Street, and he looked the part, suit perfectly tailored, every move smooth and deliberate, like he had the whole world right under his control. When he talked to you, he made you feel like the only person in the room. I remember that first night so clearly. He'd reserved a table for some big-shot clients, and I was managing the event. He was in his early 30s, sharp blue eyes, slicked back hair, every word out of his mouth sounding rehearsed and calculated but somehow still sincere. At the end of the night, he pulled me aside. "You, Noreen, you've got an eye for details. I like that," he said, his gaze lingering just a little too long. "When are you going to let me take you out and show you what I mean?" I remember laughing, brushing it off, but somehow, by the end of the week, I was having dinner with him. At the time, I thought it was the beginning of something beautiful. I didn't know it was the beginning of a nightmare. Fast forward 3 years, and I was Mrs. Daxton Wolf. I'd traded my modest event planning job for what Dax called a life of sophistication and luxury. He'd convinced me to leave work, saying it wasn't fitting for a wife of his stature to be seen scurrying around events for strangers. I left reluctantly, but I was in love, and part of me felt like I was moving up, like I was doing what was expected of a real New Yorker. For a while, it felt exciting. We'd bought a condo in the West Village, a sprawling 3-bedroom with floor-to-ceiling windows. I had a closet full of designer dresses, and we took vacations to the Amalfi Coast in Paris, where Dax had business but somehow always seemed to have enough time for long dinners and sightseeing. He'd say, "You're so lucky, Noreen. Most women would kill to have a life like this." And for a time, I believed him. But slowly, that life turned out to be much lonelier than I'd imagined. Dax was always working, always entertaining clients, always somewhere else. I ignored the whispers and side glances from friends and neighbors when they'd say, "Dax has such a busy schedule, doesn't he?" I told myself it was just how his work was, how the world worked, and that I was being silly. It wasn't until our 5th anniversary that the illusion really shattered. We'd been planning a trip to Tuscany for months, but 2 days before, he canceled, saying he'd been called to Tokyo for some high-stakes deal. I remember feeling crushed but determined to be understanding. I texted him, "I get it, work's important. We'll do something even better when you get back." He didn't respond for hours. And when he did, it was one line, "It's not just about work, Noreen. Grow up." I was stunned. Grow up? For the first time, I felt a crack in our marriage, something I couldn't ignore. I tried to brush it off, but that one line kept playing in my head, echoing through the condo as I sat there, alone. Then, one night, he left his phone unlocked on the kitchen counter. Normally, I'd never have looked. But something in me, some instinct I'd pushed down for years, took over. My hands trembled as I swiped open his messages. And there it was, strings of flirtatious texts, hotel reservations, dinner plans. There were even photos of him with other women, glamorous and much younger than me. The world felt like it shattered in slow motion. Every piece of his betrayal lay right in front of me, undeniable. When he came home, I was waiting for him, standing in the kitchen with his phone in hand. "Care to explain this?" I asked, barely holding back tears. I held the phone up, showing him the messages. His face didn't even flinch. He looked at me with a slight smirk, almost as if he was amused. "Noreen, you're blowing this way out of proportion," he said, reaching for a glass in the cabinet like we were discussing the weather. "These women mean nothing. They're just entertainment." Entertainment? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "How could you do this to me, Dax? To us?" He chuckled softly, almost condescendingly. "Do what, exactly? Give you everything you could possibly want? A life most people can't even dream of? Stop being dramatic, Noreen. I'm not going anywhere." "Then maybe I will." I'd never heard myself sound so determined, so certain. He stopped mid-pour and turned to face me, his face darkening. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," I said, the words coming out stronger than I felt. "I want a divorce." He laughed, actually laughed. "A divorce? You think you can just walk away from all of this? That's cute, Noreen. But you're not going anywhere. I'll ruin you first." My blood ran cold. The man standing in front of me didn't look like the husband I'd once loved. He looked like a stranger, someone who saw me as a possession, a pawn he could manipulate. "If you try to leave me, I'll make sure you end up with nothing, he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. Every penny. Every ounce of your peace of mind. It's mine. You can't just take it. I stood there, stunned, every inch of me screaming to fight back, but I felt paralyzed. He wasn't the charming, successful man I'd fallen for. He was ruthless, controlling. I realized then that he saw me as nothing more than an accessory to his life. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I'd spent years supporting his dreams, putting my life on hold for his ambition, and now he wanted to keep me trapped, to control me even as I tried to break free. The next morning, I went to see a lawyer. Her name was Delphine Macon, a sharp, no-nonsense divorce attorney who'd come highly recommended by a friend. She was a middle-aged woman with an air of authority and a reputation for not backing down from a fight. Let me guess, she said, as I sat down across from her. High net worth husband, thinks he's untouchable? I nodded, feeling a weight lift just from being understood. He's threatened to ruin me if I try to leave. She leaned back, crossing her arms. Men like him always do. They think they're invincible because they've got money. But money only goes so far. I felt a spark of hope. For the first time, I had someone in my corner, someone who wasn't afraid of Dax and his threats. Over the next few weeks, Delphine and I met in secret. She advised me to gather as much evidence as possible, financial documents, emails, anything that could be used in court. She warned me to be careful, though, to act normal around him so he wouldn't get suspicious. So I did. I played the role of the docile, defeated wife, just like he wanted, while I quietly built my case behind the scenes. One night, while going through some old files in our shared office, I found something that would change everything. It was a thin, black folder, hidden under a pile of old tax forms. Inside were statements from a bank in the Cayman Islands, a place I'd only ever heard about in movies, where the ultra-wealthy hid their money from the government. I remember sitting there, holding that thin black folder in my hands, feeling like the universe had handed me a lifeline. The bank statements were detailed, showing large sums deposited over years into an offshore account I'd never known about. This wasn't the same as his public portfolio or any savings account we'd shared. This was hidden money, millions he'd stashed away, money he thought I'd never find. For weeks, I quietly researched offshore accounts and tax law. I learned that the IRS had specific rules for reporting foreign income and accounts, and what I found on those papers confirmed Dax had broken just about every one of them. He hadn't reported a single dollar, which was highly illegal. He was smart enough to hide the account but apparently too arrogant to think he'd ever get caught. The more I read, the more I realized the enormity of what I had in my hands. This wasn't just something that could cost him money. It could cost him his career, his reputation, even his freedom. But I knew I had to be careful. If I moved too quickly, he'd find out, and he could make my life a nightmare. I met with Delphine, showing her what I'd uncovered. She stared at the papers for a long time, a slow grin spreading across her face. "Oh, Noreen," she said, shaking her head. "This is beautiful. This is exactly what we need." "Can we use it?" I asked, my heart pounding. She looked up at me, her eyes fierce. "More than that. We can destroy him with it." We decided to lay low for a while, gathering more documentation and creating a paper trail that the IRS couldn't ignore. Delphine introduced me to another attorney she worked with, a specialist in financial fraud cases. His name was Leonard, and he was sharp as a tack, meticulous in his methods. "We can't just wave this in front of his face and hope he caves," Leonard said, scanning the documents. "If we do this right, we'll make sure he doesn't even know it's coming until it's too late." Over the next few months, I learned to live a double life. By day, I was the dutiful, quiet wife. I smiled at his clients during dinner parties, played the role of the supportive spouse, and pretended like nothing was amiss. But at night, I was building my arsenal. I documented every expense, every suspicious transaction, every shred of evidence that painted a picture of the man Dax truly was: corrupt, ruthless, and dangerous. Then came the night that would finally set everything into motion. Dax came home late from a supposed business dinner. He'd been out of sorts for weeks, restless and irritable, probably because he sensed my withdrawal. He poured himself a drink and eyed me from across the room. "You're acting strange, Noreen," he said, his voice low. "Don't think I haven't noticed." I forced a smile. "Just tired, I guess. Everything's fine." He leaned in closer, his expression hardening. "Remember what I said? You try anything, and I'll ruin you." I met his gaze, not flinching. I was done letting him intimidate me. "I haven't forgotten." For the first time, I think he saw something in me that unsettled him. He straightened, downed his drink, and left the room without another word. But I could tell he knew something was wrong. That was the last night I spent in that condo. The next morning, while he was at work, I packed up my things and left. I moved into a small apartment Delphine had helped me find, somewhere Dax wouldn't think to look. I felt a strange freedom, even in that small, bare space. I knew I was finally taking control of my life. It took a few more weeks, but we finally put everything in motion. I filed for divorce, knowing Dax would come out swinging. And he did. He tried every trick in the book to intimidate me, to make me back down. But I was ready. When he finally received the divorce papers, he stormed into Delphine's office, demanding to see me. I was sitting in the back, watching as he threw a tantrum, yelling and insisting that I'd regret it. "You think you can just take my money and walk away?" he screamed. "I'll leave you with nothing, Noreen. You'll end up back in Ohio, living in a shoebox." I stood up, stepping into the light, and looked him right in the eyes. "I don't need your money, Dax. I don't need anything from you. But you're about to lose a whole lot more than money." He glared at me, not understanding. Delphine handed him a thick envelope, a copy of all the evidence we'd compiled. "Consider this our official notice to the IRS," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We'll also be sending copies to the SEC and the Department of Justice." He tore open the envelope, his face turning pale as he flipped through the pages. Every transaction, every hidden dollar, laid out in excruciating detail. His hands trembled as he realized what we'd done. "You can't do this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Oh, but we can," Delphine replied smoothly. "And we already have. By tomorrow morning, the IRS will have every document they need to open a formal investigation." I saw the fear in his eyes, the realization that his perfect, protected life was crumbling right in front of him. He tried to compose himself, but I could tell he was panicking. "You have no idea what you're doing, Noreen," he hissed. "This will destroy me." I held his gaze, feeling the weight of years of betrayal, anger, and heartbreak finally lifting. "That's the point, Dax. You destroyed me once. Now it's your turn." He stormed out of the office, but there was nowhere for him to go. By the next morning, the IRS was on him like wolves. They froze his assets, seized his accounts, and started tearing through his financial records with a fine-toothed comb. Every lie, every hidden dollar, every under-the-table deal was exposed. And with each new discovery, the walls closed in on him a little more. The investigation dragged on for months, with Dax desperately trying to save himself. He called me, left pleading voicemails, begging for help. "Noreen, we can work this out. Just tell them you made a mistake, that you misunderstood." But I never returned a single call. I didn't need to. I was finally free. In the end, Dax was charged with multiple counts of tax fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. He faced up to 20 years in prison, his reputation in tatters, his life shattered. All of his high-powered friends disappeared, his assets gone, his firm in ruins. He'd tried to ruin me, but he'd ended up ruining himself. I sat in that small apartment, reading the news updates as his trial unfolded. I felt no sympathy, no remorse. For the first time in years, I felt at peace, knowing I'd taken back my life, knowing he'd finally faced the consequences of his actions. And as I sipped my coffee, looking out the window at the city that had once felt like a prison, I realized I was free. Truly free.